What is nitric oxide? And no, it's not the laughing gas that you get at the dentist office. What happens to our body's ability to create nitric oxide, and why does it diminish as we age? What foods can we eat to pump up the production of this magic molecule? And why do so many common over-the-counter products like mouthwash, antacids, and antibiotics crush our body's ability to produce nitric oxide? As Dr. Nathan Bryan says, chronic diseases is caused by two things, and two things only. One, the body missing something that it needs, or two, it's exposed to something that it doesn't need. Today we want to give you what your body needs, so listen in closely and say YES, yes, to NO, nitric oxide. Side note here, the initial interview took place at my office in February prior to COVID-19. Since then, there has been a tremendous amount of research into the subject of nitric oxide in preventing and treating the coronavirus, especially in the African American population who, as the data show, are the most vulnerable. All right, I am here with Dr. Nathan Bryan. Nathan and I got to know each other, or have got to know each other a little bit, because one of your business partners, a man named Bill Huff, reached out to me because he really wanted to get in touch with my father, who, as I'm sure you know, is a huge fan of nitric oxide. And so I basically brokered the phone call, made it happen. And while I was listening to the conversation that you were having with my father, I was like, holy smokes, I've got to get this guy on the Plant Strong podcast, because he is probably the foremost authority on the planet on nitric oxide and everything about nitric oxide, which my father refers to as the magic molecule. I think you refer to it as the magic molecule. And it seems like most Americans don't know what it is, what it does, how important it is to disease prevention. So I'd love to spend the next 30 minutes or so with you talking about your what you've discovered since plunging yourself into the study of nitric oxide, and how our listeners at home can benefit from this knowledge, what they can do to increase their nitric oxide production, make sure that they're not somehow disrupting the NO production and things of that nature. So for starters, what is nitric oxide?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's recognized in the scientific and medical community as one of the most important molecules produced in humans. So it's a gas. It has a half-life of less than 1 second, but it's produced in the lining of the blood vessels, where it regulates blood flow and oxygen delivery, and it's responsible for maintaining normal blood pressure. It's a neurotransmitter in the central nervous system. It's how our immune system fights off invading pathogens. So when you lose the ability to make this critical magic molecule, a lot of things go wrong. So you lose, your blood pressure goes up, you lose the regulation of blood flow, you develop erectile dysfunction, vascular dysfunction, you develop cognitive disorders, so the neurotransmitter function in the central nervous system is lost. And then you become somewhat immunocompromised because your immune system can't generate nitric oxide to fight off some pathogens, whether it's bacteria, viruses, or fungal infections. So that's kind of the basis of what nitric oxide is and does.
So, I mean, if this is considered one of the most important medical discoveries in the last 100 years, why is it that if we were to go, talk to, let's say we went down to Whole Foods Market, right? And we asked 100 people, do you know what nitric oxide is? I bet you 90 would say, I have no idea. Are you talking about the laughing gas at the right at the dentist? Or they don't know. Why do you think that is?
Well, historically, we know that it takes, on average, 17 years for new discoveries to become so-called standard of care or made aware to the public.
Interesting.
We're about 20 years after the Nobel Prize was awarded, and probably 30 years after the discovery of nitric oxide. So even that is a little bit slow based on the average. And I think the reason that is that clinicians don't use this as part of their initial screening. There's no labs that you can go. So if you can't go to your physician and say, hey, doc, what are my nitric oxide levels? He can tell you your vitamin D levels, your cholesterol, all that. But there's no commercial labs that'll tell you what your nitric oxide levels are. So that's number one. And then number two, there's really no nitric oxide-based therapies on the market that even if they did diagnose nitric oxide deficiency, there's really nothing on the market in form of drug therapy that corrects this. So one thing I've learned is that physicians don't like to diagnose something they can't treat. And then number two, that really we've been slow in developing drug-based drug therapies that correct nitric oxide deficiency.
So you talk about in one of your several books about how as we age, our nitric oxide production typically decreases.
Correct.
Why is that?
Well, there's two ways the body makes nitric oxide. And these are discoveries over the past probably 20, 25 years. The first pathway is through an enzyme that's found in the lining of the blood vessels. And so that enzyme is called nitric oxide synthase. It's found in endothelial cells. And that's really the age-related production mechanism that declines the older we get. So we know that usually we lose about 10 to 12% of that per decade. So by the time we're 40 or 50 years old, we only have about 50% of the nitric oxide we had when we were younger. And so that's bona fide, verified, scientific data. And there are a number of things. So that's on average, I should say. But we now know that as these new diagnostic or medical devices come to market that tell us our vascular age, we're now seeing 18 to 20-year-old kids with a vascular age of a 50 or 60-year-old. And to the contrary, we're seeing 50 or 60-year-old people with a vascular age of a 20 or 30-year-old. So just because you don't want to follow the average, because the average person in America,
right?
I'm not interested in being average. The average person is overweight, sick, broke, and unable to exercise or perform to their full potential. So we have to figure out how do we get away from or deviate from that average. So the older we get, so the standard cardiovascular risk factors, smoking decreases nitric oxide production, eating, an inflammatory diet, processed foods, things like that cause endothelial dysfunction. So all those standard cardiovascular risk factors lead to a decrease in nitric oxide production. Sedentary lifestyle. So that's the pathway that gets less and less with age. But this backup redundant pathway that we can use through diet, primarily through a plant-based diet, green leafy vegetables that are enriched in inorganic nitrate, we've recognized a pathway in humans that can utilize the nitrate to serially reduce it down to nitric oxide. But so plant-based diet is important, it's good, provides benefit, but there are a number of steps in that pathway that are required for patients to get the benefit of a plant-based diet. I should say a nitric oxide benefit of a plant-based diet. The other important thing is that without many other nutrients, micronutrients and vitamins that are assimilated into vegetables require nitrogen. And so if the soil is deficient in nitrate, that vegetable is going to be deficient in nitrate, but it's also going to be deficient in things like chromium, manganese, magnesium, these trace minerals. So that's a way that you could standardize, obviously, the nutrient density of a lot of these vegetables. So that's number one. It's a high variability on the vegetables you eat. And then number two, nitrate is inert in humans. So humans do not have the genetic or enzymatic capacity to metabolize nitrate into nitric oxide. So this is 100% dependent upon bacteria, primarily oral bacteria, and some gastrointestinal bacteria that we're finding as we go from the mouth all the way down to the anus. We can interrogate this system. But here's the problem. There's 200 million Americans that wake up every morning and use an antiseptic mouthwash. And that is doing more harm than good. I think it's with good intent because people don't want the people wake up with bad breath. But we've published the facts that when you use a mouthwash, your blood pressure goes up. And this is a fundamental problem in American society because 2 out of 3 Americans have an elevation in blood pressure. And that's the number one modifiable risk factor for heart disease. So the fact that you use mouthwash and your blood pressure goes up told us that there's an important connection between the oral microbiome and systemic blood flow and blood pressure regulation. And then the other thing is, another 200 million Americans are on an antibiotic at any given time in the year. So systemic antibiotics kill the the good bacteria.
Right.
So this 2-electron reduction of nitrate to nitric oxide, or nitrite, that happens in the oral cavity is disrupted by antibiotics and mouthwash.
Which more than 50% of Americans are on at any given time.
That's right. So you can be doing all the things that you're supposed to do. In fact, I was on the doctor show a couple of months ago where we recognized that if you use mouthwash, you actually lose the vascular benefits of exercise. So think about this. You could be doing everything that we've known has been healthy for hundreds of years. Moderate exercise and a plant-based diet.
Yep.
But if you're using mouthwash, you're not going to get any of the vascular benefits of either of those. So that's a fundamental, I think, groundbreaking observation. And I think it's the reason that some people respond to a plant-based diet and they can lower their blood pressure. Other people, you don't see any change in blood pressure.
Right, that's fascinating. So what is the solution there then when it comes to the mouthwash? Just, brush your teeth. Can you brush your teeth? Is there anything with fluoride?
No, I'm a big proponent of brushing your teeth.
Yeah. I mean,
that's brushing your teeth, but you have to use a fluoride-free toothpaste because
fluoride-free toothpaste.
Yeah, because fluoride is an antiseptic, antimicrobial.
Okay.
And it's also a neurotoxin. But so, I tell people brush your teeth, brush your tongue, and the bugs that we're interested in that are responsible for this are on the dorsal part of the tongue.
So dorsal meaning what?
Meaning the very back of the tongue, near the gag reflex.
Okay.
So you can brush your tongue, but just don't gag yourself when you're doing that.
Yeah.
So that's an important consideration. And then the other huge problem is, so that gets us from nitrate to nitrite. To get us from nitrite to nitric oxide requires stomach acid. And we've got over 200 million Americans that are using antacids. That's just prescription proton pump inhibitors. That's not counting. It's very difficult to quantify the amount of over-the-counter purchases for things like Prevacid, Prilosec, these antacids for people that have reflux disease.
And so does that then wipe out the gastrointestinal?
You completely eliminate the blood pressure lowering effects of both nitrate and nitrite.
Yeah. And
these drugs also further inhibit the vascular production of NO. So if you're on an antacid, particularly a proton pump inhibitor like omeprazole, those are they were prescription-only drugs. Now you can buy them over the counter. But those basically shut down nitric oxide production from both pathways. And now we have we've known for probably 5 or 6 years that people who have been on antacids for 3 to 5 years have about a 35% higher incidence of heart attack and stroke. And no one made that connection because what in the hell does stomach acid have to do with heart attack and stroke? Well, now we know it's a nitric oxide-related phenomenon.
Wow.
So 200 million people use antacids. 200 million people use proton pumping or mouthwash. Another 200 million people are using antibiotics. That's more than the population of the U.S. Now, there's some overlap in those, obviously.
Yep.
But what that tells us is that no wonder, it's not a surprise to me that cardiovascular disease remains the #1 killer of men and women worldwide. It's not surprising to me that 2 out of 3 Americans have an elevation in blood pressure.
Yeah.
Over 50% over the men over the age of 40 report some degree of erectile dysfunction. It's a vascular problem. It's loss of nitric oxide.